From Idaho's News Channel 7, this is Viewpoint.
Welcome to Viewpoint. I am Justin Corr. Today on the show, we're talking to Congressman Russ Fulcher. He represents the massive 1st District of Idaho. That's all of the west side of the state from West Boise over, including all of the Panhandle. We had this conversation a few days ago. We talked about immigration, healthcare, farming, but first, we talked about the growing pains in his hometown and mine of Meridian and all across Idaho.
It's just explosive growth, but it's an injury of excellence if you want to think of it. People want to be in Meridian. People want to be in Idaho. I mean, our growth has been outstanding, and it comes with growth pains, but at the same time, look, it's a lot better than people wanting to flee, right?
Right.
So, and we're getting some good economic growth and wonderful opportunities, and there's a lot of good people coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly they're in Meridian and across Idaho, and you talk about it being proof of how incredible of a place it is. You do see that continued growth, and people saying, well, I don't want it to grow anymore, but I guess the proof is in the pudding as far as handling growth, the fact that that growth continues.
Yeah, that's right. So, and the infrastructure is always slow, right? When you get growth, you got to catch up with the infrastructure. You go through the growing pains, but again, you know, I get comments all the time, seriously, from colleagues from all over the country. And inevitably, they'll make a comment about, I wish I had in my state what you do in Idaho. I wish I had your quality of life. I wish I had your constituency. I wish I had the environment that you operate in. And it's things that people don't think about. You know, many of my colleagues have to have full-time security all the time, right? Wow. Because that's the environment that they live in.
Right.
Okay, I don't need to do that. This is Idaho, and so we are blessed in so many ways. We have the growth opportunities. The education system is good, and so we're blessed.
Dealing with that, you have the Housing for the 21st Century Act. Talk to me about that and what it does.
So with that growth, also, as you know, comes increased home prices.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard for especially the younger generations to buy homes. It's just so expensive, and so and that's not unique to Idaho. We're definitely impacted by that with all the growth and the increase in home prices. But it's in many places across the country. So there's some recent legislation that we passed that is an attempt to try to make that a little bit easier. For example, you know, with this legislation, manufactured homes, right, that typically have to have a solid foundation. The criteria has been relaxed on that, so you can potentially get a loan or a repair loan for things like that. There's also some requirements in there that a certain amount of the loan percentages need to go to rural areas, right, not just the urban areas, and things like that. Community banks, small community banks, having access to the federal programs. And so I think there was about 43, if I remember right, there's something like 43 separate pieces of legislation that got included in that.
Oh, wow.
In one form, things to just try to adjust the system and make it more feasible to buy a home. And that's the other thing. If you're in a position to buy a home, that gives you a good financial foundation. It's a great investment in almost all cases for the future that provides for family stability. So this is, we're not throwing new money at it. We're just changing the rules to try to make it easier to buy a home.
I've done a fair number of stories on that housing crisis, and it sounds like this can do a lot to help. Is it going to do enough? You think it's going to make much of a dent? You know,
you just don't know until you implement these things. I think ultimately it goes back to your local economy, how that's governed, and the tax rates, and do people have enough income in their pocket to be able to do that? And so there's a lot of factors, and government is not going to fix everything, but we can do some things to try to make it just a little bit more feasible, and that's what this is about.
You talked about growing up in Meridian, grew up on a dairy farm. Talk about the importance of agriculture, not only for Meridian, but I mean, this whole state.
Well, first of all, for me personally, It was a fabulous way to grow up. I mean, everything, I took it for granted at the time, right? Because it was so normal then. We had a small dairy farm in South Meridian, and I thought everybody grew up that way. But the work ethic and your exposure to life and death issues with animals and dairy cattle, beef cattle, all that, but in addition to that, look, the ag industry is still the backbone of our state economy. We're potatoes, right? Everybody knows about our potatoes. It's including the president. I get comments from him about that all the time. But the ag component, dairy component, we're 2 or 3, depending on how you calculate it, in the country for dairy. So, first of all, not only is it our economic foundation, but also this is a homeland security issue overall. If you take a look at it from a national standpoint, we are not just self-sufficient within our country for providing what we need, but we also still provide a lot to other parts of the world. And so now there's some challenges there, but the health of the ag economy, the health of the ag industry has a direct tie to our homeland security as a nation. We can't, just like critical minerals, it can't be dependent on other countries that may not care for us, may not like us for our food supply. So there's ongoing challenges there. The industry is changing, as you know. It seems to be consolidating. So the small dairy that I grew up on doesn't exist anymore. You know, we had something in the neighborhood of 50 milking cows, I think, and about 100 maybe beef cows. Now, a small dairy is 5,000.
Right.
So, you know, it's a different world, different economy,
Yes.
but it's critically important for our future.
Speaking of dairy, the Idaho Dairymen's Association has been calling for immigration reform for a number of years, almost a decade, specifically with the H-2A program, seasonal workers. Their season, as you know, for dairy is 24/7/52. So a seasonal worker program doesn't work for them. What's your take on their calls for reform there?
Well, I certainly understand it. They're not the only ones, but they're probably leading the charge. And when I say we, Congress has been very reluctant to address this for the previous 4 years because the border was open. Okay. And we always felt, and I concur, that the first step in any kind of immigration reform is you have to be able to manage your border. You have to be able to secure your border. Well, that's been done. Okay. And so now there's multiple proposals on the table to change that. Personally, I think that, look, first and foremost, it needs to be a legal process, okay? And a documented process, a legal process. And the bottom line is that if someone wants to come into this country to work, I think that's great. There should be a channel to be able to do that, but also a legal pathway, so to be blunt, where they pay their component of the taxes, right, for the services that they would retain as a function of coming in. My understanding is many of the workers who come in, they would like to be citizens. There's a significant percentage who really don't want to be citizens. Okay, if they want to be citizens, let's make a path available for that. Let's make it accessible so that citizenship can be achieved through legal means. But if not, and they're maybe seasonal, or they don't want to stay for a long time, they want for a seasonal life for them. They want to come in. They know they want to go back. Okay, let's have the program with some flexibility so that they have a legal means to do it, but also a responsibility that comes with it, so that our citizens aren't covering expenses for entitlements that they would use while they're here. So that's a long-winded response, but there's a couple of principles there. Number one, make sure that it's legal. Number two, that it's fair in the sense of to all citizens, that whoever is here, they're carrying their weight, if you will, for services.
Okay. Have you seen any ideas on how seasonal workers, migrant workers might be able to pay, as you said, pay their way, pay their fair share?
Sure, and as part of the visa program, just have that built into the structure. And there's several different options that are on the table and being developed now that I think I think there was a Workforce Modernization Act that was on the table several years ago.
Yeah.
That's back with some tweaks here and there, and that's being debated among different members and different industries, because there is a difference between like the dairy industry that's year-round and some of the ag seasonal work. So you need to make that work, but we do need a workforce, and I think there's a good legal way to do it. We just have to debate through it. I think we'll get it done.
Let's talk about some of your other recent work on agriculture issues. Gray wolves, grizzlies, death tax. We can talk about it all at once or separately.
Well, those are big issues in various parts of Idaho.
Yeah.
We know that. The House has done more on that than the Senate has.
Okay.
The House has passed independent legislation that would delist gray wolves.
Okay.
And that is currently, I think that's been done once or twice, and the Senate has yet to act on that. There is, if I recall correctly, there has also been action at the committee level to do the same with grizzlies. In the lower 48, by the way, this doesn't apply necessarily to Alaska. Hawaii doesn't need to worry about it. But
I hope not.
Yeah, that's right. But those are big issues here, and not surprisingly, where the pushback comes is from states or areas that don't have any wolves. They think, look, these are nice furry puppy creatures, and we don't want to do anything to harm them. Well, overwhelming majority in Idaho say, hey, look, this is they have really multiplied. They're not endangered anymore. In fact, my cattle herd or my sheep are endangered as a function of that. So once again, this has gone through at least half of the process. The president has indicated that if it comes to his desk, he would sign off on that. So I don't think we need to worry about that. Does it have the ability to pass the muster in the Senate? We'll find out.
All righty. Let's talk about the death tax. You talked about family farms, even though they're going away, this would help those family farms being passed down through the generations.
Yeah, well, just, take a look right here at home on property values in the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? What used to be maybe $1 million property is a $5 or a $10 million property.
Yeah.
And so the so-called death tax on the federal level applies when someone passes away and that generational transfer takes place to the heir.
Okay.
And that was at a $7 million value. That's now been increased and permanently put in place at 15.
Okay.
So inflation is a big part of the reason for that, but also just try to encourage the ongoing, if there's been wealth that's generated, we want to try to keep that in the economic system. And so I think that was an appropriate move. It gets looked at every few years,
sure.
But this is a big change. And part of the reason is the inflation, part of the reason is just an effort to try to keep that economic wealth in the economy.
We are continuing our conversation with Congressman Fulcher. Right after the break, we're going to chat about rural health care, Medicaid cuts, and even making our national parks safer. All that and more straight ahead on Viewpoint. Welcome back to Viewpoint as we look back on our chat that we had with Congressman Russ Fulcher a few days ago. We started this next part of our conversation talking about the Rural Health Transformation Program, how Fulcher says it would help keep Idahoans healthier, but how critics say it does not do enough to offset the cuts in Medicaid and Obamacare.
Tends to be better health access and coverage in more urban areas than rural areas.
Sure.
Well, if you take a look at Idaho's demographic, for example, some 40% of our population is within about a 30 to 40 minute drive radius. And so large state, we have a lot of rural area.
Right.
And if you're not in that Boise, Meridian, Treasure Valley, Ada Canyon, or perhaps a pocket, Idaho Falls, Pocatello, Coeur d'Alene, then good chances you don't have access to the care that locally that you really need.
Right.
So part of the thrust here is to improve the access specifically pointed towards rural areas. And I think overall, it was I forget the overall number, except for Idaho qualifies for about $1 billion over a 5-year window. And so, and that's spread out at 185-ish million a year for 5 years.
Okay.
And that's strictly for the rural areas. It's never been done before. But also the rural hospital, for example, they are under a tremendous amount of pressure because they don't necessarily have the cash flow that the urban areas would have. And so to provide those services, which are expensive, this is an effort to try to improve the care. And if you can do that, then over the course of time, you'll save money because hopefully people are healthier and better access.
Right, preventative care instead of
Yes.
treating things after. Critics have said it doesn't do enough to offset cuts to Medicaid, Obamacare. What do you say to that?
Disagree. There's still a lot of misinformation on what happened with Medicaid. The major changes, if you will, that happened with that is to me no-brainers. I mean, making it illegal to claim Medicaid from 2 different states. We have a lot of people who moved into Idaho recently who had still been claiming their Medicaid from their previous state, right? And so that was one significant change. The other one is if you're a working age, able-bodied person, working age, able-bodied single person, then you don't qualify for it. Well, it was never designed for that in the first place. And so, and if they did qualify, then that means that those in the target population would not have anything left to cover them. So we want to take care of the most vulnerable through those programs. Those were the big changes. And there's, with healthcare in particular, that's such a big issue. There's so many factors to it. But in my opinion, the changes to Medicaid were actually more fair for the target population, and with this rural health incentive, there's at least an effort to try to balance that out and make the care more accessible for everyone.
Let's talk about the Making National Parks Safer Act. What does that do?
Well, so our national parks really are a treasure, and I'm sure you've had an opportunity to see some. And
I went to Yellowstone shamefully for the first time last summer, and I'm like, why haven't I been here every summer?
Yeah,
unbelievable.
It really is, and so our lands in particular are such a treasure, and so we want to encourage people to visit and to enjoy that for a whole host of reasons, for cultural reasons, for if you grow up in Washington, D.C., okay, you have no concept of what Yellowstone is, okay? Right. That's a life-changing thing in a positive way. So I go into that just to communicate with that increased traffic and whatnot. We don't have a emergency communications system in many of those areas. So if you do have an incident, you can't just pull out your phone and dial 911 or the emergency line. And so anyway, this is not new money per se. It's redirecting some funds to say, okay, we've got to have the infrastructure so that we've got an emergency connection through our national parks, so that if there is a problem, you can hit the emergency and somebody's going to show up. Fantastic. So that's what we're trying to do.
Stay safer out there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your recent appropriations. First, funding for reactor demonstrations projects. I imagine INL was happy about that.
Justin, we have an arms race, a new arms race, and it's called AI. And it's similar to the arms race back in the Cold War era with nuclear weapons, only now it's about AI. That takes a massive amount of energy, a massive amount of electricity, plus the other needs. As a growing area, as a growing country, we need more electricity, we need more power. Nuclear is one of the facets, and we need it from all sources, right? But nuclear is one, and it's important to Idaho because that's where so much of the research is done at Idaho National Lab.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is clear the field to shorten up the process that it takes in order to qualify a new energy source. With our efforts here is we're trying to take existing technology and put it at, for example, a military site, and and plug that in there as a training. I won't say training, as a qualification area, right, where it's contained. And it can be monitored, well managed tightly to a specific area, specific region. And nuclear is just one of the sources. There's others, by the way. Idaho is a pioneer with geothermal.
Yeah.
We've got pioneering efforts to try to expand that, set the example for other states to do that. So energy is a finite problem. Micron, not to segue too much, but the growth that Micron has here is largely contingent on the amount of electricity, the amount of power.
Right.
Nuclear is one of the solutions that would potentially solve some of those expansion needs, and that we're trying to make that more accessible.
And finally, fully funding PILT. For people who don't know, what is PILT and what are you doing there?
Okay, well, this is a big one. Idaho is one of only 5 states where more than half of the land mass is federally owned, okay? 54 million acres.
Wow.
Well,
yeah. Like the National Forest,
that's right.
places like that.
Forest Service, BLM, Department of Ag, Department of Interior, they have the responsibility for managing that. Well, that means there's not the local municipalities and the state government. We can't generate revenue through a property tax. Can't necessarily control the actions on that land, whether there be a timber harvest or a grazing project or whatever. That all has to go through a federal process. And so there is a fiscal penalty, if you will,
right,
to not having the ability to control or have a levy a property tax. So once upon a time, and I don't know all the history, but a program was put in place called PILT, Payment in Lieu of Taxes, to offset some of that. It's a subsidy basically from the federal government to the states that have that helps offset the fact you can't generate revenue there.
Right.
You still have to build roads through it. You still have to, right? So this is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge because that's mainly a subsidy to the West, Idaho in particular, from the Midwest and the East. Well, if you're a member of Congress from Connecticut or Florida or New Jersey, do you really want to be sending subsidy money to Idaho? And the answer,
over there,
that's right. The answer is no, they don't. And so I understand that. So that's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. And we've actually lost some. There's another program called Secure Rural Schools. We lost that funding. We were able to get it backfilled just recently at the end of 2025. But long term, we're going to have to figure out another solution, I believe, and it probably will have to do with the state is going to have to take some more responsibility in the management of those resources, and because the subsidy from other states is not popular with the rest of Congress, and it's harder and harder for us to achieve that.
I appreciate the Congressman's time very much. We're going to wrap up Viewpoint right after this. That is all of our time for this week's Viewpoint. Thank you so much. I'm going to see you tomorrow on the noon, the 4, the 2:08, and the 6 p.m. news. Man, I am busy, but it's an important time to be covering the news for you, especially as the legislative session rolls on. Going to talk all about that on the 2:08 and those other shows as well. Then I'll see you right back here next Sunday morning for another Viewpoint.